Hello and welcome back to week six of health, population policy and planning. So the first topic today is population diversity and health policy. So far in the unit, we've examined really this socio-political, economic, cultural and historical context around policy. So historically, we've looked at the changes from private patients' relationship with doctors, to the right of people to have access to healthcare, to the idea of rationalised health services. We've also looked at perspectives of policy, so economic, political, sociological, and we've looked at how these different perspectives have influenced some of that policy environment. In addition, we've looked at the policy-making process itself and the institutions which underpin it, such as the rational decision-making model, for example. So essentially, this policy environment is what ends up influencing and shaping policy, but both the environment and the policy process are shaped by key policy actors. So these are powerful groups which shape policy environment and the policies themselves. And if you like, what we could say is that the interests of powerful policy actors represent, if you like, the structural constraints around policy making. So how do we navigate around these structural constraints? So what we haven't done so far is understood or explored how these structural constraints, what they mean for the health of the broader population as a whole. And also, our populations, for example, served well by policies. So populations are quite diverse. Who benefits from health policy or lack of them? Who is disadvantaged by health policies or also lack of them? And also, we need to consider in all of this, can health policy achieve greater health equity if we have these very powerful actors shaping things in their own interests? So in the next few weeks, we'll be considering each of these key questions. But this week in particular, we're going to be focusing on exploring the population diversity. So identify and examine the needs of diverse populations, but also exploring how they interact with policy making, particularly health policy making. So let's look more closely then at population diversity and health policy. So evidence suggests that poor health outcomes are due to a complex mix of social determinants. So these are very much upstream things like employment, education, housing, transport, access to health services. These are all the material resources that are required for health. We can also think upstream in terms of early childhood experiences, so trying to prevent trauma in childhood, because we know that it has a long-term disadvantages and impacts on health. And of course, one of the other things that we need to consider is the social gradient. So evidence suggests that our relative position to others impacts our health, and it impacts our health in a number of ways, as the famous Whitehall studies have shown. So how does that respond in policy terms then? So of course, we have some distributive and redistributive policies. We have some social housing, we have PBS, we have Medicare. But in terms of the more upstream welfare type programs, these have been rolled back over the years. So we've got to the point now where the majority of the policies that we have to address social determinants, such as access to healthcare and healthcare services, are fairly downstream. Of course, on the other hand, we do have a different upstream approach by promoting particularly behaviour change. And this happens through physical activity or through educating people about better diet, so on and so forth. But we're not really, what is the success of these sort of upstream behavioural policy actions? Who do they benefit? Are they working? So essentially, we know that upstream preventative behavioural policies and programs are more effective with higher SES groups. And we also know that low SES groups, because of the evidence from the social gradient, carry the higher burden of disease. So essentially, those are the people whose behaviours we want to have the most impact on, but essentially these policies are not working. So we need to understand then the underpinning mechanisms shaping behaviours to understand this. Why is it that low SES groups have behaviours that are health degrading instead of health enhancing, and why are those behaviours so difficult to change? So in order to look at these underpinning mechanisms, I'm having to introduce what we call power relations, this idea of structure and agency. If you've done sociology before, this will be a really, you'll probably be aware of this concept. If you haven't, that's okay, because I'm going to take you through it. So what are social structures? So essentially, social structures really are about the ways in which we categorize or make sense of each other, the way we interact with each other and organize ourselves. And they involve relations of power and subordination. So for example, othering. So we have this view that you are what you are, and that people that are different to you have a different status in some shape or form. And of course, all these things are central to issues of identity. So things like class, age, your gender, your sexuality, your faith, your disability, your race, all form key structures which inform who you are as a person. And as I've said earlier, they also, though, shape the way we interact with each other. And they're central to how we experience the world. So for example, if these structures are hierarchical, which all of them are, we know that class is hierarchical, age we could say is hierarchical because there's an idealized embodied view of the body, which tends to be young. But again, wisdom and experience is valued in older people. Gender, we know that there's differences between men and women. There's still men still have much more power in society than women, and so quite several sociologists consider women to be subordinate, if you like, in this power relationship with men. Sexuality, so heterosexuality is normative, but anything that doesn't meet that tends to be viewed with suspicion. Disability, so ability, of course, is considered normative. Disability is considered something as different and othered. And so is race, and so is faith. So Australia is not a very religious country, but essentially we can't ignore that faith plays a part in this, because there has been an increasing rise of Islamophobia in most Western democratic nations. So let's now look then, if those structures are hierarchical, how does that impact agency? So essentially, agency is our individual capacity to act independently and make our own choices. So structure and agency are interdependent concepts. So social structures essentially inform the way we think, feel, behave, and relate to each other. So as a woman, for example, I behave in ways that are expected of me to behave as a woman. If I suddenly started behaving like a man, throwing my weight around and replicating some of the behaviours that are acceptable in men, it would be noticed, for example. And similarly for men, if they suddenly started to behave like women. So if you like, structures enable or can constrain our agency. And it depends where in this hierarchy, this hierarchical structure you are positioned, as to whether you are enabled, your agency is enabled or constrained. So let's take gender for an example. So masculine ideals require men to be strong, powerful, to contain or restrain emotional outbursts. And the only time that it's acceptable as a man to have an emotional outburst is probably with anger and violence. So that's becoming less acceptable in society overall. But it wasn't, 50 or 60 years ago. Feminine ideals require women to be, first, it's an embodied ideal of what a woman should be, so youthful looking, slim bodies, but also this idea that women are more caring and nurturing because they do the bulk of child rearing and family caring, so on and so forth. So if you like, the way we behave as a man and a woman is constrained by these structures about the way, we instinctively understand that there are cultural rules which require us to behave in certain ways. And so if you like, our agency is the reflection, the way we behave and is a reflection of those hierarchical structures. And agency, the practice of gender, then reinforms those structures. So if you like, structure constrains or enables agencies, because it's the rules, cultural rules and regulations around it, but then people behave in particular ways, which then reinforces the structure. So we have this kind of cyclical thing going on. And in this way then, gender inequalities, so differences between men and women, and these stereotypes are both produced and reproduced through this structure and agency relationship. So let's look more closely at structure and agency in health then. So firstly then, if we're saying that social structures are the things that determine norms, and that norms enable or constrain us in particular ways, then norms might enable or constrain our individual health agency. So our ability to behave in a way that promotes health for us. So for example, I've got on the right here a little article that was recently in the ABC News, and it talks about how class shapes what and how what and sorts of things that kids have in their lunch boxes. So it did tend to report essentially that there's way too many processed food in kids' lunch boxes, but it also looked at kids from a particularly socially disadvantaged background area of Melbourne and an advantaged area of Melbourne, so roughly relating to class. And what it found is that kids from middle-class families, although they still had processed products in their lunch boxes, they tended to have much less sugar. So essentially then, you know, middle-class people's agency around health is enabled, perhaps through their status as being educated, their access to particular information and knowledge enables them to make the right choices around health. If you come from a more disadvantaged background, then you know, that constrains your ability to make the right choices around health for your children. Also, social norms enable or constrain health through discriminatory practices. So we can be discriminated on the basis of age, of sexual orientation, of religion, of gender, of disability. And we know that these are bad for health because they tend to lead to social isolation and social exclusion. And of course, health resources can be enabled or constrained as well as a result of these things. So discrimination, for example, which occurs in healthcare settings, particularly towards marginalised people, might mean that they don't get the right sort of treatment at the right time, helping them manage particular chronic illnesses, or preventing even death and even diseases that progress and cause eventual death. So, you know, there's quite a lot of evidence suggesting that there is racism in the healthcare system, and that Aboriginal people and homeless people experience that. So in summary then, structures are identity forming. They shape our interactions with other people. It's how we understand other people. It's how we classify and categorize them. And we do them in relation to ourselves. But these structures, age, gender, class, so on and so forth, are hierarchically organized. And power relations, the power relations inherent in those structures, in those hierarchies, therefore privilege some individuals, but at the expense of others. And the social gradient is a good example of this. We also know that these power relations, though, don't just cause us psychosocial issues around health, but they have material outcomes. So that might be limiting our access to health resources. And the structure and agency interface isn't just about material outcomes, it also informs health behaviours. So it constrains or enables our agency in particular contexts, and therefore results in better or worse health outcomes. In terms of limitations, though, the assumption is that each of these structural and agentic relationships operate separately. So we're discriminated on the basis of gender, or race, or class, or faith, or sexuality. Or those structures inform the kinds of ways we behave as a woman, as an Aboriginal man, as a working class man, for example. so on and so forth. And what we'll look at in the next topic is how we can get a better understanding of these particular issues. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in topic 2.